one really good explanation for our cognitive faculties reliability is that we were designed to navigate this world.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the KKT Show podcasts. I am joined today by Dr. Mitch Stokes. Mitch Stokes is a senior fellow of philosophy at New St. Andrews College in Moscow, Idaho. He received his PhD in philosophy from Notre Dame under the direction of Alvin Plantinga and Peter van Inwagen. At Yale, he earned an MA in religion under the direction of Nicholas Wolterstorff. He also holds an MS in mechanical engineering, and prior to his philosophy career, worked for an international engineering firm where he earned 5 patents in aeroderivative gas turbine technology. His books include Short of Faith to the Head, Be a Confident Believer in the Age of Cranky Atheists, and How to Be an Atheist, the book we'll be discussing today, why many skeptics aren't skeptical enough. Dr. Mitch Stokes, it's a huge honor to have you on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. It's good to be here.
Yeah. Dr. Stokes, can you maybe tell me a little bit about your engineering life and how that shaped your view of science and how it functions?
Yeah, that's well, a lot of the actual education and my career working in engineering, doing some research and development. So I got to do experimental stuff in computational fluid mechanics. And so we got to do a number of the theoretical things and some of the experimental things. But a lot of it at that time it really wasn't a lot of, I hadn't thought through science that philosophically apart from doing science. And then it was when I started having, I had always kind of had doubts about Christianity, and there was a time after my undergrad that I really was struggling with figuring out how Christianity and science fit together, and it was a real crisis time. But that was when I started to read more and think more philosophically about science.
Yeah.
But I was always kind of skeptical generally. That was just my temperament.
Right.
To doubt and to be skeptical. So I don't think it wasn't necessarily so much my scientific education per se. I think it could be partly that, but a lot of it had to do with just my temperament and the lack of philosophical understanding I had about science.
Right. Yeah. And so should we wonder about the philosophical basis for science? Because whenever I see people who are scientists, or some of my friends as well, and they talk about the practical applications of science as such, but not necessarily the foundational level. So it's almost as though why it's pragmatic, it works. So why dig deeper and go into metaphysical musings that don't really help? So that's the basic idea. So I wanted to ask you if why that's such a prevailing notion, and is there value in pursuing a study in the foundational ideas of science, the philosophy of science, if you will?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question, and actually is really a topic that's relevant to the front lines of physics, particularly where do theories go next in physics? We have quantum mechanics,
quantum
and
mechanical
relativity,
interpretations, right?
And then you certainly have the different interpretations of quantum mechanics. And that's been going on for a long time. And you have the sort of, I think the quote is attributed to David Merman, I think, the shut up and calculate kind of view. And it's like, look, we're just not going to get anywhere when it comes to looking behind the scenes of the mathematics. But it's starting to become, there are a number of things. First of all, physicists are starting to pay a little more attention to the possible interpretations of quantum mechanics. But not only that, when we're looking at where to go next, some of our theories in physics, our standard model of particle physics, general relativity, our particle physics and our theory of gravity, we're still not done with physics. And so there's some questions about the next steps to take. Should it be something like string theory? Should we go in another direction entirely? But the whole point of all that is that figuring out where to devote your energy and time in terms of theory development is dependent upon your philosophical views about what a scientific theory should do.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And that goes all the way back to, it goes all the way back to Newton and before, but with, you have at the foundations of, say general relativity with Einstein, and then you have quantum mechanics and Niels Bohr and some of the other people. And they have these really big discussions about what is the purpose of a theory in physics and how to make that connection. And it directs which way you might go. And there are today some people in physics, a big question is, we really don't have much more experimental data coming in that will push us beyond, say, where we are in particle physics. So you don't have this constraining data that kind of guides you where to go. And so something like string theory is not necessarily based, you can't really confirm or disconfirm it based on experiment. So what do you use to direct and guide theory development? Well, this is the big thing. This is where some people are getting concerned that physics it's becoming too philosophical, and it's becoming too disconnected from the empirical or the physical world.
Yeah.
And so, so now the big topic is how philosophical these topics are all philosophical.
Right. Yeah.
So you actually can't. Einstein and the founders of quantum mechanics and general relativity and that whole beginning of the 20th century, they were consciously aware of philosophy and making deliberate philosophical choices. But then you get to after World War II, the physics became much more devoted to
empiricism,
practical applications, and then you have much more of the shut up and calculate kind of attitude.
Right. And that's made me wonder, because a lot of scientists would hold to a sort of empirical view, right, of how we move forward. And the idea behind that is usually that empiricism is our most reliable method to obtain knowledge. So that at least on a superficial level strikes true. Yeah, that seems true. And when they tell you that, and when you talk with people of like mind, they always say, look, it's all empiricism. So long as you can observe and tally and calculate, that's it. So isn't empiricism the most reliable way to gain knowledge? And if it is, then why bother with other methods of obtaining knowledge?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, there's something to certainly empirical methods, and science has got to make this connection with the world. But now it's certainly true the way most of us learn science and the way most of us apply science or do science. A lot of it is just you're basically doing calculations and pushing the numbers into further and further into the cracks, so to speak.
Yeah.
So you can in many ways take this kind of narrow view and go, look, we can just stick to, there's enough work for us to do just to do new calculations and whatnot. And that's certainly part of it. But to understand, well, there's a couple of things. First of all, as I just alluded to, the notion of where do we go next when it
Yeah,
comes
yeah,
to physics? That's a big philosophical question. And every time we've had these revolutions in, are you still there? You got,
oh yeah, yeah. But sometimes the my video might get cut off,
okay, yeah,
but
that's fine.
you
That's
know,
fine.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, no, that's um, anytime there are these revolutions, you have to have people who have thought philosophically about it, either to say, hey, don't go in this direction, let's go in this direction. But then there's also, and this is maybe just more of a personal temperament, if you really want to understand, I think you know, scientists and engineers, I mean, I think we're really one of the reasons these the STEM disciplines are appealing is because they show how the world works. I mean,
yeah,
that's part of why they're puzzles to solve and things like that. And I think there's a lot more going on than to support science and to understand it fully. Science is supported by all kinds of philosophical beliefs that we now take for granted. And I think it's perfectly within a person's right to not care about those. That's fine. But if you want to see the big picture and you want to really understand how it all fits together, you can't ignore the philosophy. And I think this is one of the things that when it comes to, let's say, there's a certain kind of, some people have become atheists because they think that science has shown that there's no God, right? So
yeah.
they don't believe, they believe in atheism for supposedly scientific reasons. Well,
It's very
already
common.
right there, say
Yeah.
that again.
It's very common here too. The thing that you just mentioned, because it seems as though science is the answer to everything. I was just saying that because it's the same argument that I hear quite a lot in the urban circles, at least youth,
Yeah,
millennial urban circles here. Yeah, yeah.
right, right.
That's the argument.
So in but what's interesting is that when you do that and you make these, atheism is a philosophical claim. So once you say that science shows that God doesn't exist, you're doing philosophy. Now you might not call it that. You might think, okay, well, no, I'm not. I'm doing science. Well, that's just bandying over words. You're you're not doing any sort of empirical work to show that God doesn't exist per se.
Right,
It's
right. Yeah,
so I think to say that and not everyone does this, but to say that your atheism, science is supporting your atheism, is to do philosophy, and it's to go outside of science.
right, right. I I I want to come back to that because that's really interesting. So I'll come back to that in my in the second part of our discussion because I want to face it in the kind of the way in which you've written the book. So it's knowledge, and then there's science, and then it's morality. And so I want to go like that, and I want to see if that'll help us because so
Sure.
initially we're discussing about knowledge, and yeah, that's why I asked about empiricism. I want to discuss on the God is the people not being able to prove that God doesn't exist, but to stay on knowledge, you mention the problems of sense perception and reasoning. And so the argument, and I've heard it from some circles too, is basically, and tell me if I'm putting this wrong, but it's effectively that you're using your senses to justify your senses, and that's circular. Ultimately, it is a circular argument to say that my senses are reliable, because you've got to use your senses to say that, and that seems to be true in reasoning as well. So ultimately, it's sort of a circular loop. But that seems to be similar to the problem of criterion that people talk about. And So I've heard of atheists approaching this in a number of ways, and one of the things that I've heard of them, one of the arguments that I've heard them use when people talk about this is the coherentist approach, that you don't necessarily need a metaphysical grounding. You don't need to add further metaphysical baggage. It's so long as you can sort of balance what you know with how you know it, then that's it, and that helps you form a good picture of the world. And to add on to that, the fact that we've moved on from Euclidean geometry to non-Euclidean geometry, or rather we've found that out, and moved on from a Newtonian understanding of the world to quantum mechanical understandings of the world, would give us pause in assuming sort of a common sense metaphysical view of the world. So assuming that, wouldn't the coherentist approach have some merit, or would it? It's yeah.
Yeah, I actually think that a kind of a coherentist view, there's a certain respect in which we're all stuck in a coherentist kind of view, and that's just the nature of our knowledge. We just can't. So, for example, that's the reason that movies like The Matrix are so appealing,
Yeah, yeah,
is
yeah,
because there isn't a way to step outside your cognitive faculties to check whether they're true, they're reliable.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so there is a sense in which you're stuck as develops the best story of the
Right.
world, and you have to do that. So I do think that now the question is what counts as the best story,
Yeah.
and a lot of that's going to be, I think we tend to have common values, like well, even just the name coherence, we value logical coherence. We don't
Coherence.
want any contradictions or anything like that. So
Yeah.
that's one of those things that we do value. Another one is, well, that's the main one, and the other one has to do with uh, our sense perception. It's kind of like empirical adequacy in scientific theories. You want your theory of the world to match your sense perception, but you also want it to
Right.
match
Right.
your strongly held beliefs too. A lot of times, and a lot of times we don't realize that that's what we're doing.
Yeah.
There are,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
and I think that, but all that going back to your question about coherence, I do think a kind of coherentist view, when it comes to just our own limitations, you're kind of stuck in that.
Yeah.
Now, how do you get out of that? Well, you kind of have to assume that your cognitive faculties are reliable. Well, you do have to assume that. Now, what's the rationale behind assuming that your cognitive faculties are reliable? Are you doing it in terms of pure reason? Well, that can't be, because the matrix world is exactly the same either way. So
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
pure
Yeah.
reason alone isn't going to decide for you.
Yeah.
And if you say, well, come on, like, who's going to believe? I mean, because no one does believe in the matrix world. So look, who's going to believe that? That's just a philosopher's doodling with words kind of thing.
Yeah.
But it's actually, when you think, okay, well, so you're saying, based on all your background beliefs and your experience, that the best explanation for everything that's going on in your mind and sense perception is that there really is an external world outside your mind. Well, that's not pure reason alone. That would be, you'd have exactly the same reasons in a matrix scenario.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you
Yeah.
can't get
Exactly.
out of this by pure reason and sense
Reason.
perception.
Yeah.
Now, so but anyway, so a lot of the point is, you do have to just accept some things up front and just go,
Yeah.
in order to get this going, get this whole reasoning process going, I'm just going to have to trust my cognitive faculties.
sort of like axioms. So that's the truth that I stand on, that they're reliable, that my cognitive
Yeah,
faculties are reliable.
right. And if you say, well, why are those axioms true? It's well, then they're not axioms really. You're starting to reason to them.
Yeah,
That said, though, I think you can have kind of going back to the coherence view. I think you can kind of test the axioms to see how coherent they are with the rest of what you believe. But there comes a certain time when in order to, you've just got to know that, hey, I'm just going to accept that my reason is reliable, because if I were to doubt it, I'd have to be doubting it for some reason, I guess. I mean,
yeah,
but usually you doubt it for some reason, which is to trust reason. So there kind of gets
right,
to a
right.
point where it's almost like you can't get out of the, if you want to play the reason game, you can't get out of the
Yeah,
assuming certain axioms. There are just certain ways to play the game. And if you give those up, then it's a different game.
right. Yeah,
Um,
yeah. So if we are to assume that to be the case, then I guess would a pragmatist approach help? So yeah, well, that's it. I'm not going to assume metaphysical baggage. I'm not going to assume anything else. It's just me and my cognitive faculties. They are kind of reliable. I know that people around me have that, and I know that for centuries past that's been the case. I think we dealing with induction a bit here, but let's stick with cognitive faculties. So yeah, I see that people around me use that, and they seem reliable, and I see that I can use that, and it seems as though I can function pretty well. So assuming some sort of functionality to these, then well, that goes. So why assume anything metaphysical? Why assume God? It's just there. It's just
well, that's a good question. I guess I would ask the question. I would say, well, it might not. I'm not necessarily like, at least in my own personal case, I'm not assuming that God exists. So God isn't an axiom for me. The other thing too would be to assume that you're not in the matrix or whatever the skeptical scenario is, or you can say a computer simulation, which some people think that
yeah,
there are actually arguments for that, whether or not you think that those are good arguments, but it's not, when it comes to reason, they're not contrary to reason. They are contrary to our values a lot of times. But I would say already just going, you know what? I'm going to assume that my cognitive faculties are reliable. That's a metaphysical, you're already doing metaphysics there. Now, most people are hardwired such that they don't go through that process.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
so thankfully, you don't have to be a philosopher to do that. But once you start
Yeah,
thinking about those and you
yeah,
go, okay, fair enough. But I am going to trust my cognitive. Okay, that's fine. I think that's great.
yeah, 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 yeah. All right. So that's part of the that's sense perception, and part of that I guess is also induction. So Alex Malpass, Dr. Alex Malpass, he wrote this article about inductive inferences, and he makes his claim that, and I wanted to ask you that too. So he says that even if the apologist says that God has promised to maintain uniformity in nature, he's not revealed to us which inductive inferences are true and which of them are wrong. So ultimately, the Christian is in a similar boat with the atheist in the sense that both of them have to rely on the evidence to decide or whether the inductive whether induction is justified in this case. So uh so yeah, so inductive inferences. What's the point of, because and I'm not saying you do that, but I've heard a lot of apologists who claim that the problem of induction can be completely solved, or is it dissolved? Anyway, the idea can be,
Yeah.
addressed with a theistic conception, specifically a Christian theistic conception of the world, the problem of induction. So I wanted to ask you, is that a a claim can be justified. And what do you make of Alex Malpass's view that inductive inferences are right and wrong? So ultimately, all of us are based on just picking out the evidence.
Yeah, I would say, well, I would definitely think that the believer and unbeliever are both in the same epistemic boat in the sense that they can't justify induction by using induction.
Yeah, yeah,
So they can't do that um, per se. And I think the best that they can, so you have both have to accept that induction works. So you're kind of stuck. Either you think it works or you don't. Um,
yeah.
and there's not an argument for the reliability of induction. You just kind of have to you have to accept it. So I
Sort of
think
similar to the faculties. Sorry to
what's that?
interrupt, but sorry to interrupt, but sort of similar to the cognitive faculties. You
Yeah,
just
well, I
have
think
to.
yeah, and induction, and I think induction is based on deduction, induction, the inference of the best explanation are all predicated on our cognitive faculties, and it's a use of those. And you you can't give an argument for their reliability. Now, what you can do is going back to the coherence view and go, okay, given that they're reliable, what's the best way to explain their reliability?
Yeah,
And so it may be, I mean, I think one really good explanation for our cognitive faculties reliability is that we were designed to navigate this world
yeah,
in a way and given cognitive faculties to navigate it reliably.
yeah,
Now, of course, another way is to say, sure, yeah, no, we do navigate. We were given these cognitive faculties, but it wasn't by a designer. It was natural selection with
through
genetic
evolution.
mutation, and
Yeah,
then maybe
yeah,
some other thing. Again, there's still not a entirely filled out view, but enough that you can give some gestures towards uh, a purely naturalistic explanation for the reliability of our cognitive faculties.
right.
So
So
again, in
even,
both, go
yeah,
ahead.
even for induction, so you can have a purely naturalistic description for the reliability of that.
I think, well, what you can have an explanation for that.
Right.
You say, okay, the previous organisms at some point were able to, once we had, you have to assume somewhere along the line we got reason, and this sort of inductive process proved to give us a survival advantage, and therefore we have there's this evolutionary explanation for
Yeah,
why induction would be why we would be able to rely on it. Again, that's not justifying induction, that's taking induction for granted.
yeah, yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. But reason would be an emergent property then.
Yeah, stepping back and going, okay, well, what is the reason, and even further back, consciousness, and trying,
Consciousness.
figuring
Yeah,
out, okay, well, how does the material world result in that? Um, again, you'd have to have you can have some sort of explanation for it, and then you're just weighing different explanations. Is this the
yeah,
best
yeah,
one? Is this one better than this one? They might all have something desirable, like they might not all be perfect, but you want to choose the best explanation
yeah, yeah.
for that.
I struggle with the idea of emergent properties, attributing that to morality or reason or all of those to those, because it seems that at a fundamental level, you all of them become an illusion in some sense, because if morality is just an emergent property, or if free will is just an emergent property, so foundationally that doesn't exist. So it just happens along the way. So
Yeah, well, I guess now you back up into, okay, when you talk about an emergent property, what exactly are we talking about? First of all, can you have any sort of, does emergent mean that it's somehow different from physical, or can you have you have these physical states that end up somehow you get, I think Murray Gell-Mann, I mean, he's not a philosopher, he was a physicist, but he says emergence is getting something new out of nothing new.
Yeah,
So you're getting this,
yeah.
you build up to a certain level, and then all of a sudden it's the whole is greater than the sum of the parts somehow.
Which, it's hard to wrap my mind around, especially when we're talking about factors like reason and consciousness, which really don't seem to fit well with a purely materialistic description of reality.
Yeah, and that's and there's quite a bit of work done on this notion of, I mean, this is outside of my competence when it comes to the studies of consciousness and emergent properties and all of that.
J.P. Morgan talks about it.
Yeah. JP does talk. He talks quite a bit about it.
Yeah, love this book. Yeah.
Yeah, and then and then there's just issues of dualism generally.
Oh, yeah.
Can you have a soul with this material? Is the relationship between this immaterial soul, and so dualism is a very typical view for Christian philosophers. About the most I can say competently is that it's a mystery. I mean, it's certainly a mystery to me.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So,
I wouldn't be. It wouldn't be if. So suppose that we had a purely physical explanation for reason, or go back, consciousness.
yeah.
I mean, that would be interesting. I don't think it would say anything against the existence of God. I mean, that would be, it's not like, I don't think an argument for God's existence, at least for me, doesn't necessarily rely on consciousness not being emergent.
Yeah, but the materiality of it might suggest theistic conceptions.
So you could say, all right, well, maybe there's this notion of it being, but even let's say it turned out to be something material. There's nothing. If consciousness was somehow explainable in terms of material matter,
Yeah.
quarks and electrons, and then on
Yeah.
up, it's still pretty. I mean, again, I would be amazed that that's the case. I think the odds of, we don't know, but the likelihood of that happening accidentally is probably pretty slim.
Yeah.
So I don't think it would be. Now, I think maybe some views of dualism might be a little, but I'm not positive about that.
Yeah. So this is knowledge. This is obtaining knowledge, and I want us to move on to science, the second part of your book. So yeah, this was fascinating, and I love discussing these. So maybe we'll apply what we thought of to the discussions in science, because so quantum mechanical interpretations of the universe, and they seem to be quite a few, but at least the commonly accepted ones are the Copenhagen interpretation of the universe, which was taught to us back in school, and the many worlds Everettian interpretation, which Sean Carroll seems to be extremely in favor of, and I like some of his arguments. And then the hidden variable Bohmian interpretation. And so my question is, it seems that a lot of Christians seem to like the Copenhagen interpretation of the universe, and somehow a view of Christian idealism. Now, it's not just Christians. I've seen quite a lot of religious folk adopt the Copenhagen interpretation as some sort of justification for an idealistic conception of the universe. Now, I wanted to ask you, uh, why is that the case? And it seems to me that that interpretation is sort of discredited these days, in light of the other interpretations that we know of. So, what do you make of those three, and the proclivity of religious individuals to well, adopt the Copenhagen interpretation? Not saying it as a fact, but it does seem to me
Right.
that a lot of spiritual people seem to want to use that.
That's interesting. I actually that's interesting to hear. I don't know a lot of Christians who have opinions about the interpretation of quantum mechanics. I don't know if but I think you're right. Probably if I were to ask, I think the people who would know, who would have thought about it, I think the Copenhagen interpretation is the kind of the default, because it's been so prevalent and for so
Yeah,
long.
yeah,
Um, well, what's interesting, going back to kind of the link between that first part of the book and the second part with science, really the first part is not, when it comes to our cognitive faculties, the whole point there was you have to just accept some things. And then once you accept some things, you have to come up with the best, an explanation, or if you want, an explanation for how those cognitive faculties are reliable and whatnot.
yeah,
Now, the next part, so going on to the next part is, okay, so assume your cognitive faculties are entirely reliable, and
yeah.
assume you have a good explanation. We'll just say that we've got a good explanation for consciousness, reason, and whatnot. When it comes to science, what sorts of things can science tell us? For example, can science tell us that God doesn't exist, or that he does exist, or what are the, and so at least in the book, I'm much more skeptical about interpretations. Well, and of course, there's a lot more going on to physics than just the quantum mechanics. I mean, when it comes to quantum, you
Gravity.
have quantum. Well, there's quantum gravity, and then
Yeah,
there's special relativity in quantum
yeah,
mechanics,
yeah.
quantum
Coming in
field
together
theory.
and creating a whole. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so there's a lot going on there, and there's a lot going on at the borders of physics. Uh, In fact, I have a class. I'm teaching a class on physics and beauty, and just today we were talking about Sabine Hossenfelder's book Lost in Math, and so she's a physicist, a German physicist. Uh, she thinks that this notion of beauty in a theory, particularly mathematical theory, is kind of leading physicists away from the truth, and so it's lost in
The
math. We're getting
pursuit of
lost in math.
elegance. The pursuit of
Yeah. So
elegance.
yeah. So in all kinds of aesthetics, sort of
Yeah,
simplicity, elegance,
yeah, yeah.
what they call beauty. What, again, it's hard to pin
Right.
down those theoretical virtues. Anyways, but we were talking about this. One of her well, she talks to a physicist who recently passed away, Steven Weinberg,
Yeah, yeah,
and he says, "Hey, look, I spent my whole career in physics without knowing what quantum mechanics is," and what he meant was without having a particular interpretation. And so Hassenfelder's view, her view is, look, you have these different interpretations, and there's no experiment. Currently, there's no experimental way to discern between them.
yeah.
And so she's starting to wonder about, does it matter? And then when we talk about an interpretation, are we just, or when we choose an interpretation, does it have to do with, say, temperament, other values that we're interested in? But again, that's not one of the things I refrain from coming down on any interpretation. My whole
Yeah.
point is, how much do we think science can tell us about God? And I'm in the book, I take a skeptic. If I were just thinking, okay, well, what could I glean from? It's hard when it comes to what science, or particularly physics, says about the world, or what it seems to say about the world. Inferring that God doesn't exist from that is a huge step.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, anyways, all that to say is, I don't have a lot of opinions on what the right interpretation is, and I tend to be a little skeptical of, how about this, not skeptical, pessimistic right now about
Right.
whether we can. Again, a lot of it has to do with just ignorance of probably the physics, but doesn't seem like at this point we have a lot to go on for
Yeah.
choosing it.
Right. Yeah. And that's where I want to come to the place of models. So physicists place a lot of importance on models, and a model that can depict the world around us. So a lot of physicists make a lot of models, and apparently there are quite a number of them that might not need to invoke a creator for the existence of the universe. So we've got the Jim Hartle, Stephen Hawking's view of there being a beginning but no cause. There are these eternal world ideas that or maybe a something like Sean Carroll would talk about, that the time is fundamental, and what shifts is this quantum fluctuation. So the fact that you have a low entropy at the beginning might not necessarily mean that that's the quote unquote beginning. It's just moving from one stage to another. It's these phases
Right.
that we're going through when time is fundamental. And assuming all of these models, that there are quite a number of those models that don't need to invoke a creator. So I guess my question is, and a lot of physicists say that these models do in fact apply to the data that we have, because there's no way to empirically test them. So then, uh, is there merit to arguing in a sort of Kalam cosmological way when we have all of these models that kind of do not need to invoke a creator for the beginning?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I guess the first thing to specify is, we don't need to invoke a creator for what, and so it's what is a creator allegedly supposed to be doing in these physicists' minds? That
Yeah, yeah,
So what's the function that is being fulfilled by the material world that no longer needs some extra, some immaterial or extra material cause? So I would be, I mean, to say that you don't need a creator, I mean, I don't, your science certainly does, science wouldn't tell you that at all. So let's say you had, and from what I understood from someone like Lawrence Krauss's book, A Universe from
from
Nothing,
nothing.
and Hawking, at least Hawking's book with Mlodinow,
Yeah, the grand design.
yeah, it seems like there's this confusion about what we what can account for something. So let's say there's quantum fluctuations, and you can get these random fluctuations in a vacuum, whatever that means, that doesn't say that that doesn't explain the quantum fluctuations of the existence of vacuum or anything like that. I mean, all that. So I guess what I'm saying is, no matter what you specify, what kind of theory or model you come up with, it doesn't explain itself. It doesn't explain. Now you could have let's say, well, what about an eternal universe? Again, how does the exist? There's not just a temporal causation. There's also this kind of logical causation. Why is there this
Yeah,
bouncing
yeah.
universe? And how do you explain the rules for that, those meta rules for the universe? Or if it's a multiverse,
Yeah, yeah.
why all you've done is you've backed up saying, look, there's this. You still have to account for why the meta rules for the multiverse.
Yeah.
So I guess it's not clear when they're saying that they don't need God for whatever it is. I'd like to know a little bit more about what they think God was doing to begin with, and what they think is performing that function now.
Right. Yeah. Logical. The logical need for it, because even if it's not a temporal need, I guess there is a logical necessity. So we're talking about cause and effect in some sense, and that moves us all the way back to the beginning, or even the existence of the universe, if it's eternal.
Right.
Right. Here's something that I've come up against when I asked them this, that the language of cause and effect is a very within the universe thing. They say that why should it apply to the universe as a whole? Just because that we see cause and effect taking place for all that we see around us, but that's inside of the universe. But the universe as a whole doesn't need to obey that law of cause and effect. Now, I don't know if I'm exactly
Right.
articulating the argument, but that seems to me some kind of the way in which they argue. When I asked them about the logical necessity of God, but causality as such, and I was wondering, what do you make of that? That you don't need to talk about cause and effect when we're talking about the universe as a whole.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say that I would wonder why someone would think that. Is it possible to even think in terms of without this notion of cause and effect? And I suppose that someone would say, well, look, you already have that in quantum mechanics, where you have this notion of two identical states can produce something entirely different. Again, how much that's getting into interpretation.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think we're on this. If someone wants to argue against cause and effect, saying, look, I'm going to throw a Hail Mary pass and say, well, maybe cause and effect don't matter outside the universe. I mean, I guess that's always possible, but it's also a pretty empty claim in terms
yeah,
of
yeah,
what that means. I think we're starting to get to the point where it's like, I don't know if you really, I mean, maybe they can explain what it means to not have cause and effect. And so you have these meta laws. Now, obviously, laws aren't causing anything. Laws, that's another issue. But
yeah, yeah, yeah,
accounting for the existence of this universe, I think you always can go, I'm just going to stop explaining here and say, look, it's an eternal universe, or whatever it is, and it's a brute fact why it's here. Now, again, this gets to what you start wondering, okay, well, now we're starting to look at what counts as needing explanation.
yeah, yeah,
And when do you stop, and when do you think, oh yeah, no, that's totally fine. That makes perfect sense to stop there, or I guess we could stop there. But all of a sudden you're doing philosophy again about what requires explanation to begin with at all.
Yeah, why decide to stop at this particular point?
Right.
Right. Yeah.
And that's not saying, I mean, it's a free, you're, I was going to say it's a free country, but we're not in the same country. Free countries, um, people can decide where they want an explanation or not. What counts as a good explanation is oftentimes in the eye of the beholder. But what I think you can do is say, look, you require explanations in these certain cases. It seems arbitrary that you're going to stop here.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what you can do is you can say, all right, maybe you're stopping here at an arbitrary place, or do you have a reason for stopping it? And then you'd have to see that. But the question, it's a philosophical question and a deep one, where you stop that explanation. In theists, traditional Christians would normally say, for a necessary truth or a necessary being, that's where you don't need an explanation because it
Yeah.
couldn't have been otherwise. It doesn't make sense to have an explanation. And could you say that the
The
universe is a
universe is necessary.
necessary
Yeah.
being, and it's like, okay, well, give me an argument for that. It seems like everything's pretty contingent inside, but maybe there's this fallacy of composition that universes as a whole are necessary, but that's a big jump.
Yeah. Yeah. That's true. Yeah. Yeah. You know, you were talking about this, and you mentioned laws not causing anything, and and I wondered about the Stephen Hawking quote, because there is a law such as gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing, and there seems to be a similar trend in Lawrence Krauss's view as well. But why? Uh, what are they basing it on when they say that laws create something? And is it related to the model dependent realism that you talked about in your book? Is it related to that in any way? Because I can't wrap my head around it when people say the laws create something, and I guess it's ignorance on my part. But what do they mean when they say that laws create something? That I don't know if they use the word create in the way I think of it, but when they say that because there's such a law as
Yeah.
gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. What do they mean?
That's a the short answer is I don't know. The second, a little bit longer answer is I think that it's a confusion. And it may be an equivocation on what they mean. Maybe by laws they mean the universe, and they're just not being careful. But laws, typically the way they're thought of, they're not things that have any sort of causal agency.
Yeah,
They're not
yeah,
even things per se. And now you do have say a vacuum, or what you have space or space time or whatever. You have these presumably physical entities, or at least entities that can be described by physics, and those are things that have causal capacities. So I think to say to say that a law causes something is just, I think, a confusion, or they know something we don't.
yeah, yeah. Because I've still not been able to understand what that actually means. And you mentioned something called model dependent realism in the book when you talk about Stephen Hawking's view of the universe. And I wanted to ask you, what is model dependent realism, and is that a good view to have? Because I think that there is a tendency, and if I've understood it right, to relate model dependent realism to a kind of metaphysical non-realism.
Yes.
You don't really need metaphysical realism in that sense. And I was wondering, since at the fundamental level we seem to have quantum particles, and that seems to indicate a sort of indeterminacy even at the fundamental level. Wouldn't there be some justification in approaching science from this in approaching models in this fashion, in a model dependent realism sort of way. Right.
Yeah, well, I mean, the model dependent, model independent realism. That's Hawking's um, terminology, and model dependent realism is basically what he's saying is you have these theories of the world, and take one case. So you have, going back to 1600, you have Copernican theory,
Yeah.
Ptolemaic theory. So you have these two theories that, let's say, they're both give the exact same empirical predictions and description and whatnot, but what's going on behind the scenes is an entirely different story. In fact, Hawking uses this example, and he would say that because there's no getting behind the scenes, that neither of them is more true than the other. Now, presumably, he would say if one has better empirical adequacy, one would be show itself to be true.
Preferable. Yeah.
He has this, the traditional term for what he's talking about is instrumentalism.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is this notion of scientific theories aren't what makes a scientific theory good isn't whether or not they tell you what's going on behind the scenes, but
Yeah.
whether or not they're empirically adequate. And that goes all the way back perhaps to even Plato, and it's certainly prevalent in it was early Einstein had kind of an instrumentalist view, and then in the founders of quantum mechanics had this kind of instrumentalist view. The Copenhagen interpretation is probably based on something like that, where it's not really, the whole there is no quantum world kind of thing. So you don't have to worry about what's going on behind the scenes. You have this instrument. Now, what's interesting is that he goes from this instrumentalist, this model dependent view of theories, but then also infers from those theories lots of things going on behind the scenes.
Right.
Like there's no God or whatever it is. And it's an enormous jump. And my concern in the book isn't so much, is that a legitimate inference? It's that's not an inference at all. He's not making any inference. He's going against what he's saying. He's going against this instrumentalism by saying that model dependent realism is true, which not even a realism, and yet science also tells us that there's no God.
Yeah.
But if anything's behind the scenes, God is behind the scenes.
Yeah.
So it's not. So I think there's a kind of just not maybe a carefulness there.
Yeah. That's part of the science, and I wanted to move to mathematics because I know that you wrote this book on calculus, and I love the way in which you talked about math, philosophy, and art in a small video that you made. Was it for Crossway? I'm not sure, but you made a video on calculus, and I love the talk. So my question to you about math would be on Eugene Wigner's The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics. Now that's something that's really fascinated me, and I guess it really points to sort of a designed universe, that mathematics is the language of the universe, that these abstract concepts can find basis in physical nature. It's amazing to me. Can you maybe expound on that a bit, and the beauty of mathematics?
Yeah, that's one of the probably one of the most important aspects of physics. And I think actually it goes back even further than that. When you look at someone like, when you look at the Western view of the liberal arts, you can trace that all the way back to Plato, who traces it back to the Pythagoreans. And it's based on this notion of, well, so there are these 7 liberal arts. 4 of them are astronomy, geometry, music or harmony.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
did I say astronomy, geometry? So arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music or harmony. And that's 4/7 of the liberal arts. But that's just the Pythagorean Platonic view of mathematics. Those are the 4 disciplines of mathematics, and Plato talks about those in the Republic when he's searching for the notion of justice. He
Yeah.
sets out
Yeah.
on this and talking to everyone about, okay, what's the definition of justice? But in doing so, he talks about what's the ideal education for, say, the philosopher kings or the leaders of the city state. And he thinks that it's this at least a large part of it, not the entirety, but a large part of it is the liberal arts and this notion of mathematical training to think mathematically, because what it helps you to do is it helps you to go from particular things in the world to the essence of things. So rather in this case of justice, he's saying, all right, rather than looking at these particular just and unjust actions that people perform, what is justice?
Yeah.
What do they all
Yeah.
have in common that makes them just or unjust?
Yeah.
He says the way to train leaders to do that, is for them to do mathematics, partly because that's exactly what it does. It abstracts to these things. But he also has this other notion that all of physics is based on, is that the universe is mathematical and we can understand it. You have these perfect mathematical laws. The universe is somehow behaves in accord with, they obey the rules, and it obeys the rules. And then we are somehow able to understand that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so you have this whole thing. So my point in all this is that this notion of mathematical understanding and description of the physical world and just the beauty, and we haven't even talked about the beauty of mathematics, but the centrality of mathematics goes all the way back to Plato, and it's far more than just applying mathematics to the world. He thinks it's
Right.
something fundamental to human existence, which is really odd for someone like Plato, who's this, he's known as this, because of the, Whitehead said that all of at least European philosophy is a footnote to Plato.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And you don't think of him as a mathematician, but so much is wrapped up in mathematics for him, and we've kind of forgotten that. But all that to say is, I think that this, you talk about Wigner's puzzle, this unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics,
Mathematics.
it's such an important question. It seems so narrow, but I think it really is getting at something that's essentially human, that's deep within us, that is wrapped up in this notion of the world, beauty, and what we love.
Yeah.
It
Yeah. Yeah.
somehow connects them all. And actually the ancient Greeks would say that there's a moral component to that too. Like when they're talking about beauty, they're not talking about just cosmos for them. This notion of this whole universe has this notion of ethical and aesthetic goodness,
Yeah. Yeah.
and that's
Yeah.
fleshed out mathematically in many ways.
Right. Yeah. 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 And you see, I guess you see patterns emerging throughout, like the Mandelbrot set and all of that. And yeah, it is fascinating to think about that. So going from that, is there a case for classical Christian education then to
I think that's one of the, when it comes to this notion of classical, or I would just call it liberal, maybe liberal arts education. The fact that one of the detriments of our society is that we've separated knowledge into these disciplines. And I think some of that's natural and necessary, because you can't know everything, you have to specialize.
Yeah.
But by keeping those from, say the liberal arts or the humanities, I guess I should say, from the sciences, and not allowing them to connect, is really this artificial separation. And I think what classical education does is goes back to this uniting of these allegedly separate kinds of disciplines.
Yeah.
Einstein, Heisenberg, I mean, like, these guys were all classically trained. We would say that they had a classical education. They
Yeah.
knew.
Yeah.
And so you think about Newton, all of them, we'd say, oh, wow, they were classically trained. And there's an argument, I think, can be made that classical education is what allowed them to become visionaries in science.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, because of the confluence of those disciplines, you get to think of the world in a far richer way, I guess. Yeah, it truly is amazing to think about that. So yeah, Dr. Stokes, it's been great fun to have you here. We've discussed quite a lot, and I've loved talking with you through all of this. It's been a
It's been
huge
fun.
pleasure.
Thank you for having me on your show. Appreciate that.
Thank you, Dr. Stokes. If you like this video, hit the like button and don't forget to share and subscribe. If you want to watch some of Dr. Mitch Stokes' stuff, I've put in links to his books, his discussions, and his lectures down in the description. You might want to check them out as well. And well, I'll see you again next time. Goodbye.